I am an architect. What I do for a living is I take people's hopes and dreams, their desires for their home, for their building, for their office, for their school, and really interpret those dreams into physical realities, a manifestation of who they are and what they do. Our firm is here in Little Rock, and these are some of the buildings, from office buildings to library buildings right next door here to historic buildings. Each of them is different because each of them has a different client and a different dreams, different wishes. The thing that really gives me the biggest charge is designing community interaction spaces, because that's what buildings are about. It's designing the spaces outside, inside, schools, office buildings. You know, we spend the majority of our awake hours either in our office or in a school. And those spaces should be exciting. They should be wonderful. They should tell a story. Good architecture tells a story. It tells a story of who the person is, who is in that area. Environmental learning is a method where we bring the outside in. You know, one of the things that's happening in education today is well-meaning school board presidents and their normal everyday people, their primary concern is, how do I build as much square footage for as cheaply as possible? And what we end up with in office environments and school environments are places that are not very joyful to be in. And we wonder why absenteeism is so high and why kids get sick easier and why they don't want to be in school. And it affects test scores, it affects businesses. We've learned that if we provide them natural light and we give them fresh air, a joyful existence. So experiential learning is about tactile ways of engaging instead of sitting at a desk. It's about giving opportunities for children to learn by doing things and not sitting and listening. You know, the kids sit in a school all day long and they're ready to just explode when they get out. So the idea of a children's library came, you know, Bobby Roberts is just a genius. I think the whole library staff does incredible things here for Little Rock and our Central Arkansas community. But he saw a need in Midtown, in this neighborhood, that there was a need there that the kids weren't being served. But he saw this spot. Why this place? Because, you know, War Memorial Park is our Central Park. It is now our Midtown. So sometimes people will say, well, one person can't make a difference. One teacher out of hundreds of teachers, or one idea, one thought. How can I make a difference? Well, you know, we call this the ripple effect. You know, one drop of water spreading out can just cause ripples throughout an entire neighborhood, an entire city, an entire countryside. That impact can be felt through a city. And if you look at the location of where this library is, that impact encompasses all these little squares or houses. But within the microcosm of this neighborhood, within 3/4 of a mile to a half a mile to a quarter of a mile, all that you see with these homes, that's the distance that people will walk, ride, or come to a library. And there was not a library within this entire area. So we thought it was important, and Bobby thought, and the library felt like it had to go on this side of the interstate, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The blue is where people live, okay? Yellow is UAMS's campus, and then golf course, park, all of those things. The interesting thing is, the same houses that are south of the interstate, the same time period, the same bungalow houses, are the same ones that are in Hillcrest and the Heights in those areas. There's something happened about 40 years ago that really changed things. I-630 was cut through our city, and, you know, interstates are the thing that gets you as fast out of town as you possibly can go. And that's what this was set up to do as westward growth occurred. But it's the railroad tracks of our generation. It separates cities, and there's these very few points where you can go across. So all the park and the athletic facilities and the zoo are on the other side of a bridge that has rails about this high, and it's fairly dangerous feels dangerous to go across. So Bobby said this had to go on this side of the interstate. It's a neighborhood that in years past, 20 years ago, all the way to downtown was the subject of a documentary on HBO about gang activity. But it's been on the rise for the last 20 years, and this 12th Street corridor has some great pillars in the community, as you can see here, from Franklin Elementary to these churches, and then to the fitness center and the community center above. But it needed a place for kids. So back to my question. What was the number one thing that they needed? They wanted. Teach us how to feed ourselves. Really tough to hear. Last thing I expected Nintendo, these video games, give us a video lounge. They wanted to learn basic life skills. You see, these kids are coming from homes that may have parents or grandparents that are working multiple jobs to make ends meet, and they may not come home till 10 o'clock at night. And from school time through the rest of the day, they're kind of fending for themselves. The basic things of being able to open a can of soup, make a sandwich, where to go buy things. They also wanted to feel secure. They wanted a very safe, solid environment. But in contrast, number 3, they wanted an uplifting place that was full of light and cheerful, bright colors. Other things that really struck us, the next 3 things, a CSI lab, a robotics lab, and computer technology. All things you do with your hands and your minds. Now, I'm not going to sit here and read through all these things, but the library, the last one was the thing that stuck in our minds more than anything. Bobby said, I want to build a park with no playground equipment. The imagination should guide the learning experience. And that was really interesting, and that stuck in my mind. And and I went back to when I was a child. This is actually my hometown, Paris, Arkansas. From Mount Magazine, the tallest part of Arkansas, down to the river. Every geographic thing you can think of in Arkansas is in this area. This is where I grew up. This was my playground as a child. We didn't have a whole lot. My parents made ends meet. They gave us everything we could ever want, that they sacrificed for themselves. So place is what we do. We make place. But there's wonderful places that we recognize here already in our city and across Arkansas. It's important to know that place should shape every decision we make. Where the building goes, where we live, where we work. It impacts us. Our decisions affect future generations. This was my 100-acre wood experience living here. We read about it in the Pooh books. I experienced it. This place was my farm. It was my fort. It was my starship. It was all of these things. About 5 years ago, we were visiting my mom on this property, and we went down and the newspaper had blown out of the mailbox, and I was picking it up, and I turned around and my kids were standing there holding hands, looking to this almost infinity light at the end of the tunnel of this road. And it kind of struck me. I grabbed my cell phone, took a picture of it, because it struck me the fact that my brother and I played here this way. My mom, her sister, my grandparents, my grandmother was born here. That this place had tremendous meaning to several generations of a family. This little farmhouse is architecture. It's not fantastic architecture, but it's functional, it's sustainable, it does all the things that a building should do. It shades from the south, it lets light in to the kitchen on the east. This is my mom growing up. And this is the house today, over 100 years later. My first building I ever drew was a barn. This barn here, I drew every grain of the wood. But if you look at the textures and the imagination rolled without spending a dime. So how do you take those values that you remember as a youth in a rural area and allow inner city kids to get a sense of that? The freedom, the come in at dark. You've got all this land to play on. The idea was to connect this to the park, but to connect it to the community as well. So the site itself, we discovered, had water running through it in the ditches. It was a beautiful site. Left over from the interstate, as the houses disappeared, the wildness grew up. We determined that the water was coming from across the interstate, on the interstate, and it was flowing constantly. So our idea was, and Bobby said it, I wish I could do this without taking anything out of this site. So we started looking at the zoning. How do we create a public image, garden, education gardens, children activity areas, and even an arboretum, and we position the library in a way that maintains this 100-acre wood feel. And we came up with a plan that positioned the library directly in the middle, and we capture that water coming off of the interstate in the UAMS campus, and we trap it in 3 weirs that move around the building from the highlands to the lowlands. The geography set up like Arkansas and planted year after year with education pieces and signage of where we live and who we are. The biggest thing we did is we added a greenhouse, an 8,000 square foot greenhouse, and a teaching garden where the kids grow their own vegetables and they grow their own fruits. And this corner now is a public garden for the public to come onto the site to do the same. But the food is all brought in and prepared, and I'll show you where in a minute. The water itself is a fence. It allows guarded points where you cross onto the property. And then when you get into the library itself, it's about a quarter of the footprint of the building is actual stack space. The rest of it, a theater space where kids can make their own costumes, build their own sets. They can, the computer rooms, all of the meeting spaces, and we have a shelf space down here, and you'll see 3 lab spaces for the 3 lab spaces we ultimately want to put in for the kids. The thing that we set it up to do, though, was we expressed all the structure, just like Tinker Toys of our youth, and we used the colors and the excitement of those things. You know, architects always talk about that moment where you have the napkin sketch, the aha moment. You know, well, this is my version of the napkin sketch. This idea of the land falls and the roof rises, and this shed appears in the trees, where you enter on the second level and you're landing on a loft space that opens up to the world. We have a connection to the city. This is our window on the world moment where the kids come in and they can see the cars zooming through the trees. My youngest son, the first thing he did when he came in, he went and pressed his hands against the glass and watched the cars zoom through the trees. But it also puts the kids on display, and it lifts them up and gives them a sense of safety and security. But when you get down to the ground level, it is again, the 100-acre wood experience. It's okay to take your shoes off, get your feet wet, splash each other, throw rocks, walk across these weirs and all of these things. And you can see the auditorium even opens up to this. Where the other side of the building, we asked for security. They asked for security. We created this wall at the scale of the neighborhood, almost like a fort that you slip through the secured wall into a secured space that they had asked for security, yet we want a place that's open and full of light. The roof lifts to the north, and all the trees and everything opens up, and it's 100% naturally lit. So this building is a modern building, but it honors memory. It honors the memory of a lot of us that grew up in the rural Arkansas that were given a sense of this to these kids. It stirs the imagination. And then we picked up the slats and the barns and the things where natural light filters through. We created tree houses for study rooms. You know, if you got to study, it ought to be in something really cool. And again, textures of the building itself, broken down to the scale, these large porches. So it's a barn, it's a container that many things can change underneath, but it does what it needs to do. We have a stewardship of resources with the land and the environment, the people, the place. Everything is protected on this site. And the views out, we've used all the sustainable methods that we've used. It's a LEED Gold building. The roof extends 15 feet out. This is what's awesome. We focus on relationships. This is from opening week. The greatest thing about a neighborhood like this that's had a terrible reputation 20 years ago, every color of the rainbow comes here now. And everybody's equal, and the kids all, and just the way it should be. So auditorium by day, reading steps, story time, fun time, exciting time. We bring everything down to the scale of the child. Fun things, picking it all up. Community-based hands-on learning is a critical alternative. Don Ernst said that. This building celebrates community. These are my kids. sitting at the glass, looking out. Stairs are all open, totally in view of everything you could ever imagine. Compassion for others is the key. The biggest move we made was we built a teaching kitchen, twice the size of a normal home kitchen, where the kids come in, they're taught to cook, they're taught to make things. All the activities in the library, not all of them, but they're centered around food. They build things out of food, they make things. So the idea is that we cultivate equality, we break the stigma, we teach self-dependence. That's key. So the building itself is about balance of meaning and function, people, environment, geography, learning, public, private. It's also about time and priorities. It's the education programs as well as what happens around the site itself. It's the place to be. Bobby Roberts said the library, when we started this, the library needs to be monumental to the neighborhood, but not monumental to the children that use it. It just should be the place to be. And we think that we've achieved that in this building. I just got back from San Francisco about 2 weeks ago. The building was named one of 6 best examples of libraries in the United States. So I want to end with this. Architecture of meaning. The things we've talked about could not have happened if we would not have dove into the story. We wouldn't have known if we talked to those kids. We designed this building on a bent knee, eye to eye to these kids. This is my son when Heifer opened, when he was a little guy, 4 or 5 years old. I normally take a picture for my selfish purposes of me with my kids and the buildings are under construction. Years down the line, I'll be gone, the buildings will still be there, and my kids will have these memories that Dad may have done something pretty well. But if you look at all those values I mentioned, these aren't construction or design values. They're not architecture values. They're life values. If we approach everything we do with a system of values, you can't help but come out on the positive end. So as our children may not stand and wait for us to guide them back to the house like my kids did on that dirt road, they'll walk off on their own on the roads that we have formed for them. And the key is for us to design them well so that they take off on their own and they're equipped for that. Thank you.
So I'm going to geek out for just a minute.
Okay.
So I got chills in your talk, I really did. So
Good.
A little
Thanks.
more background on me to relate
Sure.
to this question. So after an early failure to launch as desiring to be the next Frank Lloyd Wright,
Yeah, right.
I ended up transitioning into technology and ultimately
Okay.
into brand consulting. And I'm listening to your talk, and obviously not having finished architecture school,
Sure.
it's amazing to me the correlation between in branding, we talk about telling stories, and we talk
Right.
about systems of value.
That's right.
So I was really found your focus on storytelling and on value systems to be so interesting. I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on your process of how you dig into finding that story and determining
Sure.
what those values
Sure.
are.
Well, I'll tell you, it takes hours and hours and hours of talking to people. You know, I had a slide up there, and I didn't mention it, but it said, good architects listen first. You know, we don't have the answers. You know, we're here to interpret the dreams and desires, but it is our job to pick out the key moments of that. I'll never forget when we were designing Heifer International, we were interviewing the owner of the founder who has been gone a long time, and after hours of different interviews, and we met everybody at Heifer and talked to everybody, one statement stuck out to her when she said in passing, you know, my dad said one time, no matter where he went in the world, everybody sat, where the important decisions were made, people sat in a circle and everyone was equal. That became the emphasis for the entire design idea for that campus. You know, it's about touching the souls, it's touching the mind, but it's about telling their message and their story. That's why there's so many people built in red brick office buildings that are miserable. You don't know what the company is, you don't know who it is, it's just the same thing over and over. And you know, frankly, guys, for the same amount of money, a good architect can do this. And so if you're working with an architect that's not doing that, tell them that. So,
Another thing that attracted me to architecture, maybe, and you touched on this a little bit in your talk, was the generational component of that.
Right.
You know, and I looked at skylines, and I thought, you know, it's amazing that that building could stand there for 250 years, and you know, multiple generations of people could be affected by that.
That's right.
On September 11th, as tragic as the loss of life was, and not to downplay that at all,
Right.
you also heard people talk about the loss of the buildings and the impact
right.
that that had
That's
on their
right.
lives because they'd grown up with that skyline. When you think about that, when you're going through that process, how does that affect you personally in terms of your legacy and the importance and significance of that? To not just think about the original occupants of this building when they take it over, but thinking
Right.
down the road, 40, 50, 60, even 100 years.
Right. Well, I'll tell you, that's one of the reasons I use the example of my grandparents' farmhouse. You know, I'm nothing like my grandfather. You know, he raised his own vegetables. He and my grandmother, they had to. They didn't have the money to do anything else. But that farmhouse served their purposes perfectly. But it also, the people that live there now don't do any of that. You know, the home was designed in a way that it met the site well. It did all the things that it needed to do, from sun, like I mentioned, the way that it could adapt. So we just have to design buildings, and we do design buildings for the next step. You know, if a company moves out of a building and somebody else moves into it, did we design it well that it's adaptable? Same thing with education. Same thing with libraries. One of the biggest ideas about this barn and this shed idea, beyond the fact that it was just a cool idea, was it's really just a container that's wide open. They can move everything around it inside. They can add playthings. They can add sculptures. They can do all these things. So as critical learning changes and the library changes, they can adapt to those things. That's the key.
Yeah. So last question.
Okay.
Another component that I think architecture and brand consulting really shares is the idea that really the fundamental element of a brand. When I do talks on branding or I meet with clients, a lot of times people will say, when I ask them, how do you define a brand? They'll say, well, a logo.
Right.
Well, the fundamental element of a brand is people. You design a brand
That's right.
around human beings.
That's right.
And obviously you design buildings with the same idea in mind.
That's right.
Some more thoughts on the correlation of those ideas and thinking people first instead of just structure and materials.
Yeah. Well, listen, whether it's an office building or it's a school. Again, I use the example of a school because, again, when it's all about the bottom dollar, the school board members, they'll have great intentions, and they usually do a really great job. But rarely do they hire someone that's going to sit in that desk as a child and see what it's like to be educated in that room. And I'm telling you, when I was in first grade, our school burned down. We were first ones in a new school in 1972, and half the school didn't have any windows. And the other half had little slot windows. And it was miserable, hated being there. So, you put them in a light-filled school, the kids want to be there, they want to be excited, and the school becomes a symbol for who they are. The same thing with these office buildings. Axiom looks the way it does because it's a technology company, and it's speed and information, Heifer sustainability, and you could see it in the architecture. The same with this library. So we like to think that you don't have to stick the sign on the building to say who you are. The building should say who you are.
Absolutely.
So.
That was inspiring. I really think you and I could probably sit up here all afternoon
Yeah.
and talk. I appreciate
it.
it.
Well, I'm around. So.
Thanks, Reese.
Thank you.